Vi har också dragit ut några artiklar som vi tycker är relevanta för den här dagen, som ni också hittar ute i foajén. Och ni kan känna er välkomna att ta varsin artikel utav de som ni tycker är intressanta. Det kommer också finnas, de här artiklarna kommer ni hitta på vår hemsida på integrativmedicin.se, och även en länk till Läkemedelsverket, deras senaste rapport som är väldigt aktuell för just det här seminariet. Det finns en del utställare som ni kan ta del av i pauserna, och så som ni hörde när ni kom så spelades pianomusik, och det var Camilla Landevik som spelade. Hon är, vad som är känt i alla fall, Sveriges enda vårdcentralspianist. Finns på Gustavsbergs vårdcentral. Från och med nu så kommer jag gå över på engelska. Hela seminariet kommer vara på engelska eftersom vi har professor Emeritus Ellen Francis pratar engelska och Nora Bateson som båda två är amerikaner. Så, awaiting this seminar, Fanny Marell, Jenny Levin and I wrote an article with the following introduction. How we look upon children and how we help them with different dilemmas are issues that must stand questioning and re-evaluation when necessary. If they can't stand being discussed, there is something very wrong. The numbers of people diagnosed with ADHD and thus the number taking pharmaceutical meds is rapidly increasing in the world as well as in Sweden. Indications suggest that we have not seen the end of this train, while at the same time more and more reports indicates that stimulant meds do not have the long-term effects we hoped for or believed. This is the main thing we are here to start conversations and dialogues of today. Now I want to present our moderator for today, Nora Bateson, award-winning filmmaker, author, research designer, president of the International Bateson Institute. Nora works with increasing perception of how we see and respond to complexity in living system. Her work crosses many fields: biology, education, politics, economic, medicine, anthropology, and so on and so on. In the bottom line, she's an expert in system theory. And we have Fanny Marell. She's a psychotherapist with a private practice. She's a supervisor and educator. She has been acting within social service, child and adolescent psychiatric, as well as specialist for eating disorders. She's a part of editorial staff on the Fokus på familjen. And in the end of the day, she's very dedicated of well-being of children. So now I'm more than happy to hand over this seminary to you, Fanny and Nora and Alan.
I would like to suggest that there is much more research to be done in many more capacities, and that research requires that we begin to perceive and to examine this crisis of increasing ADHD in other ways. So it's with that in mind that Fanny is now going to introduce Alan, and I look forward. I'm going to be the moderator of the conversations this afternoon, and I look forward to bringing you into a discussion that is not only interdisciplinary but also crosses lots of contexts, and in that sense is transcontextual as well. I look forward to that, and for right now, here's Fanny.
I'm Francis.
Short.
Yeah, short. Your credentials are pages and pages on internet, and that would be boring to take all that now. So the reason why we chose you to come today is for your extensive knowledge of the psychiatric diagnostic system, and as the former chairman of the task force of DSM. We need your knowledge as we want to develop the relationship between our understanding and the treatment of ADHD today. So, very welcome, Alan. Take the both of them.
How many people here are psychiatrists? And how many of those are child psychiatrists? How many people are pediatricians? General medical doctors? Social workers? Psychologists? Other kinds of counselors? Family therapists? Nurses? Occupational therapists? Have I left anyone out? Teachers. How many teachers? Basically, ADHD brings out the worst in people. It leads to all sorts of silly ideological confrontations. It leads to a loss of common sense. And more than anything, it leads to way too much medication for people, for kids and adults who don't need it. The basic summary of what I'll be saying is that ADHD is a valuable diagnosis when applied to the few, and a very harmful diagnosis when misapplied to the many. And that it seems that Sweden is copying some of the worst aspects of American psychiatry in having an epidemic of fake attention deficit disorder that does more harm than good for the kids who are misdiagnosed. And there's always a reaction against this among some people to say, well, it doesn't exist at all and should never be used as a diagnosis, never be treated with medication. We're going to try at the end of the day to have a common sense approach that realizes the value of the construct in some situations, but its overuse in many others. I will start with a kind of general discussion of psychiatric diagnosis to put this into context, and then we'll discuss more specifically the mess that has occurred with ADHD. It seems like this is a very active issue in Sweden, and just having a talk will make no sense. It will only be useful to follow the wishes of the organizers, and they've been very skillful in this, to have us interact with one another and try to change each other's minds and see what we can do as a result of today that would help change things in a more permanent way outside. So I think that people should feel comfortable raising your hand and asking questions as we go along. Don't be shy. If it gets too drawn out, I will just push us forward. I have 4 sources of authority in what I say. One is Hippocrates. So 2,500 years ago, Hippocrates said, it's more important to know the patient who has the disease than the disease the patient has. And sometimes there's such an emphasis, an overemphasis on checking off symptoms that people forget who the person is presenting with those symptoms and what is the social context in which that person is struggling to adapt. So we won't forget remembering the patient. We won't become completely preoccupied with the diagnosis. The second thing he said was do no harm. Very often the rush to treatment, diagnostic exuberance, careless prescription of pills does more harm than good. The first thing we have to be sure of with any given patient or with any diagnosis is that it not cause more harm than good. And the third thing he said was, it's called the rule of thirds. 1/3 of people get better on their own. 1/3 of people don't get better no matter what we do. And we are only helpful as caretakers, as carers, as physicians, as therapists. We're only helpful with about 1/3 of the people, those where an active intervention does more help than harm. And the trouble is, it's very hard to predict in advance which group a given patient is in. The art of medicine, he said 2,500 years ago, was figuring out which patients to leave alone because they would get better on their own, which patients not to overtreat, because if they're not going to get better anywhere, our treatment may add to their miseries, to find which patients are most suitable, which patients most likely to be benefited. That's an important rule that we'll keep referring to as the day progresses. I want to honor Carl Linné as the father of classification. He was in effect the father of science. Classification leads to understanding. But I will also point out the limitations that in our field, much more complicated than plants or animals, in our field it's been very difficult to go from descriptive classification to explanation. And we'll discuss more about that as we go along. The third person that you should be aware of is Keith Connors. Keith Connors is kind of the father of the ADHD diagnosis. He did the first Ritalin study 50 years ago on ADHD. His scale is the most popular scale. His way of defining ADHD the most influential. And he's absolutely dumbstruck and horrified at the way the diagnosis is being misused today. In his opinion, probably 2 or 3% of kids would warrant the diagnosis. And in the United States now, 15% will get it. So as the father of the disorder, he's horrified at the monster that he created. It's a useful diagnosis, very helpful if confined to the 2 or 3%, but very harmful when expanded to 15%. There's also someone else who you should invite for a future meeting. We've done a number of papers together. Her name is Laura Batstra. She works in Holland. And she and I have discussed, she's the creator of it, I've just helped a little bit, an idea of stepped diagnosis, not jumping to the diagnosis, and we'll be discussing this more as we proceed. First of all, what is a psychiatric diagnosis? In Sweden, apparently, some people believe that psychiatric diagnoses are diseases. And that there's a simple biological explanation for them, if only we could understand it, that they're akin to medical diseases, that there may be social factors that help determine how they present and who presents when, but basically these are just brain diseases. A lot of people in America used to believe this, almost no one does now. We've learned too much about the complexity of the brain to think that there are simple biological answers. The brain is the most complicated thing that mankind will ever encounter, probably the most complicated thing in the known universe, at least amongst the things that we will ever be in touch with, until computers get even more complicated than we are. The brain has 100 billion neurons. That's as many neurons in this little 3 pounds of squiggly stuff as there are stars in our galaxy. Each of those neurons is connected to 1,000 other neurons through synapses. That makes 100 trillion, at least. The estimates go up to 250 trillion, but let's say for the sake of argument that 100 trillion is a big enough number. 100 trillion synapses. And these, is that me? No, thank goodness. Each of these is firing 10, 15 times a second. The neurons get to where they finally get through a remarkably complex choreography of development. And one of the things that's clear is that there's no simple relationship between genes and final brain functioning. I'll put it 2 ways. In one way, with all of these potentials for chaos, it's remarkable that the brains that we have function as well as they do, and as consensually as they do. When you think about all the weird things that have to go on before the brain connections form, it's remarkable that more things don't go wrong. It's not surprising that they sometimes do go wrong. It's amazing that we function as well as we do, and as consensually as we do. On the other hand, it's impossible for 20,000 genes to control 200 trillion synapses. It's the neurons that fire together, wire together. That experience is a very important part of how the brain develops. That there's no such thing as the genes made me do it. That there's no simple genetic relationship to any of the psychiatric disorders. A recent paper on schizophrenia found 105 genes, and the paper was reported as a positive, but that's really a negative. It was 105 genes, each of which was a tiny bit different in patients described as being schizophrenic than in the normal population comparison group. But when you have 105 genes, each a tiny bit different, you get millions of different permutations, especially when you add epigenesis and interactions with the environment. That's essentially saying, proving, I think, we're not going to ever get a simple genetic answer for schizophrenia. There have been hundreds of studies in the last 35 years on the genetics of schizophrenia. The first studies found just a very simple explanation. The more studies that are done, the larger the samples, the more it becomes clear that there won't be a simple explanation, genetic explanation for schizophrenia, and I don't think there'll be a simple genetic explanation for any psychiatric disorder. It's conceivable that there'll be an organizing series of genes that are discovered, but the low-hanging fruit has probably been picked, and what we find is such impossible complexity that we should not expect simple genetic answers. Same probably true for ADHD, probably more true for ADHD. The less biological a condition, the more social context, the weaker even will be the genetic associations. So that while ADHD may have vulnerabilities that run in families, they would be very weakly involved in predicting who, what, and when will get the disorder. And the milder the disorder and the more atypical the disorder, the less likely there'll be a biological component. So if there's a biological component, it'll be in the 2% who present very early in life with very distinct classic symptoms with tremendous severity. The more the concept of ADHD is expanded into the normal population, the less likely is there to be any biological component that will be determinable. So what are psychiatric disorders? Well, you pour, I spill. First of all, the overall definition of mental disorder, I've reviewed about 50, and I've written one, and I can tell you that there is no good definition of mental disorder in the sense that no abstract definition of mental disorder allows you to say this person has a mental disorder. No abstract definition allows you to say this or that diagnosis should be included in our classification. The definitions of mental disorder are so vague that they're virtually meaningless. By the way, that's true of disease. There's no good definition of normal. There's no good definition of disease. There's no good definition of illness, mental health, illness. These are very easy terms to use, but almost impossible to define operationally in a way that is helpful in practical problem solving. The things we describe as mental disorders are constructs. They're not real entities in the world. They're our way of looking at human distress and sorting it. The one way of discussing the epistemology of this is 3 referees. And this works a lot better with baseball than it does with football, but you'll bear with me. There are 3 referees. The first is a realist. He believes that he can define things as they really are. And the way he might call a soccer game, a football game, would be, there are goals and there are no goals, and I call them as they are. The second referee would be more a constructionalist. He believes that we don't see the world straight on. We have our own senses and our own brain mechanisms that allow us to form a consensual concept of reality, but there's no reason to think that the way we see things is the only way of seeing things, the most useful way. And so he would be saying there are goals and there are no goals, and I call them as I see them. I don't call them as they are because it's impossible to really know how things are. I call them as seems to make the most sense at the moment. And everything that's happened in the last 200 years since Immanuel Kant confirms that point of view. Excuse me, I have a cold. That our brains are constructed in such a way as to parse the sensations we get into meaningful units of knowledge. But there's no reason to suppose that the way we, at any given point, choose to summarize our knowledge is the only way of doing it. And in the history of psychiatry, there have been periodic epidemics of different disorders that are that period's best way of explaining the differences in symptoms that people are seeing. So for most of the last 50,000 years, the most popular diagnosis was demonic possession. The easiest way of explaining peculiar behavior was the devil made the person do it. 100 years ago, multiple personality was a very popular diagnosis, and 20 years ago it became very popular again. Every once in a while a book is written, a thought leader makes a pronouncement, and a diagnosis suddenly becomes very, very popular. Did you have a multiple personality disorder epidemic here? In the United States, 20 years ago, about 1 in every 3 patients seemed to have multiple personality disorder. People were going to weekend workshops, therapists, coming out very enthusiastic, and the next 20 patients they saw suddenly all had multiple personality disorder. Internet chat groups would have competition for who had the most multiples. I saw one patient who had 162 multiples, different ages, different sexes, born at different periods. Some of them were from 100 years ago, Victorian multiples. This suddenly disappeared when there were lawsuits against the therapists and insurance stopped paying for it. We don't see multiples anymore. Pseudoneurotic schizophrenia was the popular diagnosis when I trained. Then we realized that it was a dangerous diagnosis that resulted in too much medication for people who didn't need it. We don't see that anymore now. The human distress and human nature are remarkably constant. My guess is that our ancestors 50,000 years ago would seem exactly like us. Very little differences in the way they function. But the way we sort human nature, the way we put it into categories, is remarkably labile. And that's particularly true with psychiatric diagnosis because there's no biological test. It's also true with diabetes and hypertension and osteoporosis, because even if you do have a biological test, where you set the boundary can be very artificial. So Aldous Huxley said about 70 years ago that modern medicine is making such astounding progress that soon none of us will be well. And that's exactly what's happened. That the definition of various diseases has been dumbed down, the thresholds progressively lowered, so that people who were considered normal in terms of hypertension or diabetes or osteoporosis or breast cancer or prostate cancer, all of these definitions have been tremendously widened. And one of the things that's just being discovered now, 20 or 30 years after the widening, is that most of it's not been helpful. That the idea that if we label things early and we begin our interventions before the disease has progressed, we'll be able to reduce morbidity. It's a wonderful, noble idea in theory. In practice, it turns out that we probably don't change the course of illness nearly as much as we would have hoped, but we do give lots of harmful treatments that complicate what otherwise might have been a perfectly reasonable life. That prostate cancer is the clearest example. The rates of prostate cancer, thyroid cancer, breast cancer have gone up very, very high because diagnosis has become more and more sensitive, but the actual mortalities haven't changed. Many people have gotten very aggressive treatments for these conditions without living longer, but having to bear the complications of those treatments. So there's harm to be done if we expand the diagnosis without having a clear reason for doing it. The hope for biological tests in psychiatry has been great, especially after the publication of DSM-3 almost 40 years ago, and the results have been absolutely disappointing. So that there is no biological test in psychiatry now. I've been asking people, going back to about the late 70s, how long before a biological test for Alzheimer's? How long before we find a biological test for schizophrenia? The optimists always said about 5 years, but that horizon keeps on shifting further and further away. And if you ask people now about Alzheimer's, 5 years, we'll have it in 5 years. It's very difficult to get biological tests in our field, and we don't have them for ADHD. The third referee would say there are no goals or no goals until I call them. So the third referee would be a solipsist, that basically the way we see the world is very much more a function of our brains and our constructions than it is the real world. We have three umpires, three referees. One who's a naive realist, believing that he can determine what is disease and what's not disease with great certainty. And apparently you have such people in Sweden. The second would be a constructionist who believes that these are just useful ways, useful tools, and that useful is the operative word here, that a diagnosis should be judged not on some abstract criterion of its truth. It should be judged on the practical criteria of whether it helps or not. The diagnoses that help more than harm, that's the Hippocratic way of looking at it, deserve to be in the system. And a diagnosis should be given to any given individual if it will help him more than harm him. But it's not that there's an abstract truth, that there's a ADHD construct that's real. It's more that this particular label is more helpful than it is harmful for this particular individual. The third umpire would be sort of Thomas Szasz and people who are radically against all diagnosis, who would say that they're all myths, that all psychiatric diagnosis is a myth and useless. And I'm not at all sympathetic to people who take extreme views. So that anyone who believes that these are real diseases, I think, doesn't understand ADHD. Anyone who says it's a completely made up thing and completely useless and just a function of the drug companies and a ridiculous construct to even consider, I think is equally naive. That ADHD is a construct that for some people is immensely useful, but then harmful when it's overused. And that middle position of we will judge things based on whether they're useful or not eliminates a lot of arguments. That people will take very strong positions based on ideology, based on their training. But when you get to practical considerations with given patients, you often come to greater agreement. Now, how does this apply to ADHD? When we were working on DSM-4, our major job in life was to make no changes. That I felt strongly, and I think was able to convince other people in the field, that we had changed too quickly in the diagnostic system without evidence that we needed change. That there was a danger to having a lack of stability in the system without a reason for making changes, and that anything that could be misused in the diagnostic system would likely be misused. So we established ground rules at the beginning that we would not accept changes unless the evidence was so overwhelming it jumped off the tables and was about to strangle us to death if we didn't make the change. That anything short of absolute consensus would mean veto. Unless everyone could be convinced that we had to make a change, we would not make a change. We had suggestions for 94 new diagnoses, and we accepted only 2. The only additions to the system were Asperger's and bipolar 2, and both of them turned out to be disasters. Asperger's and bipolar 2 both were completely reasonable things to include in DSM-4. There were excellent reasons for including them both. If I went back to the situation with the knowledge we had then, we would have made the same decision. They both turned out to be absolute disasters. And if I were doing it again, I wouldn't include them. But we didn't predict the future. We didn't understand how they would be misused. We rejected 92 other new diagnoses. Now, we did make a change in ADHD. We made it slightly easier to give the diagnosis to girls. And the reason was somewhat convincing evidence that girls were being underdiagnosed because they more often presented with inattentiveness than with hyperactivity, and because inattentiveness tended to be lost in the shuffle, that we should make it a little bit easier for girls to get the diagnosis. We did extensive literature reviews. We analyzed a lot of data that had never been published, but was in people's computers, and we did a field trial. And we discovered that by switching tweaking the criteria just a little bit, we would increase the rate of ADHD by about 15%. And 15% seemed reasonable. It seemed possible that we were underdiagnosing girls, and so we included it. One of the rules of thumb in doing DSM-4 was never trust the experts. That any expert in a given field is going to be biased towards expanding the diagnosis of that field. That people, I've worked now with thousands of diagnostic experts, and not once has ever a diagnostic expert come up and said, you know, this diagnosis is being given too much. We're mislabeling people. We have to narrow the definition of the disorder. Diagnostic experts are always worried about underdiagnosis and missed cases. They are amazingly naive about overdiagnosis and mislabeled cases. They work in very refined settings, usually university clinics, with highly selected patients who are more likely to have the condition than people in the general population. They are completely naive about primary care practice and the fact that most diagnoses are made like that, usually in less than 10 minutes, with very little knowledge of the patient, very little evaluation, and that pills are given out also like that, and that a decision that might make sense in a research clinic where a patient will undergo hours and hours of questioning over many weeks would make no sense in primary care. So that they are constantly worried about missing patients, not mislabeling them. So the control experts, we had this strict set of criteria for making changes. But even with our strict criteria, we thought that 15% would be okay. What happened? The rate of ADHD reported in the US before DSM-4 was somewhat variable, usually around 3 to 5%. We expected, with the changes we were introducing, that wouldn't be appreciably changed. 3 years after DSM-4 was published, 2 revolutionary events happened. The first was that drug companies came out with new and expensive products. The simple stimulants had been around for 40 years. They were pennies a pill. And the whole industry in the US for ADHD drugs in the early 90s was under $40 million. So with such a low profit margin, the drug companies didn't care. And they didn't get very much involved in publicizing ADHD. With the new drug available that was expensive, dollars a pill, both the means and the motive for selling ADHD became very intense. And at just the same moment, the government, in one of the dumbest moves ever, allowed the drug companies to directly advertise to consumers in the US. It's only true in the US and in New Zealand. But you would not believe American television. Every third commercial is a drug commercial. Next to cars and beer, drugs are the biggest item of advertisement. Plus intensive marketing campaigns on the internet and in doctors' offices. The strategy of drug companies, they don't try at all to influence the development of a diagnostic system. So I never ever got a phone call from a drug company person saying, you know, I think you should do this or that. Never once. They wait on the sidelines, and once the system is developed, they try to figure out how best to misuse it. What's the way that we can game the system? And with the active, it's called disease mongering. The fancy, nice term is disease awareness campaigns, but the real term is disease mongering. It's selling the ill in order to sell the pill. It's also financing consumer groups heavily so that they will be extensions of the marketing of the drug company and lobbying of the drug company. So we had 3 years after DSM-4 was published, a combination of the drug companies now having a very expensive drug they want to sell and having the ability to market it, not just to the doctors, which they were doing heavily, but also to the parents and the teachers and to some degree the patients. The drug companies are absolutely ruthless. The latest amazing thing is candy pills. You take your ADHD pill, and it's candy, literally candy. to make it more comfortable theoretically for the child to take the pill, but in effect, conditioning the whole concept of pills as candy. The sales of ADHD pills skyrocketed, and what that meant was that the diagnosis skyrocketed. I think next year it's going to be $13 billion. So get this picture, $40 million 20 years ago. This is just US sales, now $13 billion. The rates are astounding. Currently, about 11% of kids in America get the diagnosis. 6% are on medication. If you look ahead to what will be the rate of every child in America by the time they reach 18, 15% of American kids by the time they reach 18 will have the diagnosis of ADHD. I think your rates at this point are about half of ours. I think about 3% of your kids are getting medicine, 6% of ours are. And your rates are lower than some other countries. Just in Iceland has a much higher rate than you do. Much higher than some other countries like France. Some countries are much stricter, but the mistakes made in the application of the DSM definition of ADHD have become globalized, really all around the developed world at this point. The rates have gone up everywhere to varying degrees. Now, if you were an ADHD expert who really loves the diagnosis, your excuse for this would be increased awareness is a good thing. That previously we were underdiagnosing ADHD, and that this great increase isn't the result of a fake epidemic, it's the result of much greater awareness of the diagnosis and appropriate use of medication. Now, to me, that was always a dumb argument, because having worked on these DSMs now for 40 years, I realize how sensitive the diagnosis is to very small changes in how the disorder is defined and how the definition is applied. So if you just reduce the requirement a tiny bit, you can get a huge increase in the population. It doesn't suddenly mean that the population got sicker. It means that people who went to bed the night before the definition became official as normal suddenly qualify because of the small change in the definition. And that even more than the definitional differences are the way it's applied. That if a drug company does a campaign on ADHD, its rate suddenly would go way up. People will start thinking, aha, this is ADHD. It never struck me as at all plausible that the increase in rate was because suddenly we were picking up all the right people. It always seemed much more likely that we were mislabeling a lot of people who didn't really need the diagnosis. It never occurred to me that the differences were that we were actually making more ADHD. That's one theory, that because of more use of drugs in women during pregnancy, because of the sort of discontinuities and excessive stimulation of our modern world, that maybe these were more actual cases. It's conceivable to me that that might have some impact, but that would be very hypothetical. Whereas I know for a fact that tiny changes in definition or application can shoot it way up. And it was very coincidental that the movement up came right when the drug companies had a motivation to push it. It wasn't as if all of a sudden the modern world became more complicated, or that mothers were using drugs. The chronological relationship between the drug companies pushing it and the rates going up was too powerful to just be coincidental. But if we needed evidence of the stupidity of the epidemics, it's come from very large studies done in the US and Canada, in Taiwan, and in Iceland, showing that the best predictor of ADHD is a kid's birthday. That the youngest kid in the class, in some cases, will get the diagnosis almost twice as often as the oldest kid in the class. And I don't think, people might try to explain that away, but to me that's absolutely compelling evidence that we're turning immaturity into a disease. that we're taking the fact that some kids just need to blow off steam more than others because they're younger, and we're medicalizing that into a psychiatric diagnosis, and nothing could be sillier than doing that. The way I look at the epidemic is that, fake epidemic, is that we're medicalizing educational and social problems, pinning a label on the individual person who's having trouble adapting to a situation that's better seen as, and better handled on the group or societal level, and instead giving the kid a diagnosis and giving a kid the treatment, and thereby avoiding the larger social issue or educational issue that's resulting in the concern about this kid's behavior. So we're turning individual difference, immaturity, and social and educational problems into medical problems and treating them with a pill. Now, $13 billion is a lot of money. It would be better, in my view, if that money were spent on smaller class sizes, because then with greater attention, the kids who are temperamentally more distractible and active could be managed. Or even more important, more gym teachers. We've had an educational cut, generally in the United States. The first person fired is often the gym teacher. Instead of having an active recess period outdoors, kids are kept indoors the whole day. That's going to make the kids who are normally active look like they're out of control, hyperactive. Teacher is having trouble with a class that's 40 kids when maybe it would be much more manageable if there are 32 kids. We'll be looking at the kids who are most unmanageable in the 40-room classroom and thinking, how can I slow that kid down so I can get through the day? The solution to medicalizing individual variation isn't to give a pill so that you achieve conformity and cookie cutter kids in the classroom. The solution should be changing the classroom. And in general, the psychiatric system has been distorted this way, not just with ADHD, but with a number of other conditions. PTSD is the clearest example. The US has about 10 times the rate of PTSD as UK for soldiers returning from the same theater. And that's because in our system, a soldier coming back loses all benefits unless they have PTSD. So now we have about 20–25% of our soldiers have a psychiatric diagnosis for what are really absolutely normal emotional and perceptual experiences that come after being in a theater of combat. Instead of treating this by normalizing it, by ensuring the person has a smooth transition back to civilian life, we say, unless you have a disease, PTSD, we're going to cut off your benefits. It used to be that someone coming back from war was a hero who got preferential treatment in getting a job. In the United States, someone coming back from war is seen as potentially crazy, potentially likely to have PTSD. The whole population has been stigmatized, not just the individuals. It's very hard for them to get hired. This is another instance then of taking what's a social cultural problem, how do we reintegrate our soldiers, and turning it into an individual psychiatric disorder problem, and very often over-treating it with medication. In the US, when there's an economic dip, there's a big increase in disability benefits for depression and a very large increase in suicide rates. In Denmark, that doesn't happen. I'm not sure about Sweden. I haven't seen data for Sweden. But in Denmark, it doesn't happen. Why? They have a much better social safety net. The theme here is cutting across different disorders in psychiatry. We should look in each case, especially when there's a rapid increase in the rate of the disorder, we should look for more complex explanations. Not imagine that suddenly we're picking up true cases, but that there's something happening in the social context that's causing that increase in rate. The latest manifestation of craziness around ADHD is adult ADHD. It's not bad enough that the kiddie market has become so saturated. The drug companies are now, and thought leaders in the field, very eager to extend this into the adult population. We already have remarkably high rates of stimulant misuse in colleges and high schools for performance enhancement and recreation, with the drugs coming from a secondary market of pills that were originally written by a doctor for someone who purportedly had ADHD, and then those pills are either given or sold into a secondary market. So 30% of our college kids and 10% of our high school kids use ADHD drugs that someone else got when a doctor carelessly wrote a prescription, which they buy on the secondary market to study for tests or to have fun on the weekend. The latest terrible development was partly triggered by DSM-5 when it raised the required age of onset from 7 to 12. The original construct of ADHD, and the proper construct, is that it should be present in someone at an early age. It's so easy to confuse distractibility and hyperactivity the older you get with other things, that to have true ADHD, the classic ADHD, there should be a fairly early onset, and the DSM-4 said before age 7. Why is this important? Every psychiatric condition, if you look at the book, every single psychiatric condition can be associated with distractibility and hyperactivity. There is nothing at all specific about distractibility or hyperactivity. It's part of normal. These are traits that are distributed along a normal continuum. They're useful traits. I mean, we don't have, the traits that we see in populations today aren't here because they weren't adaptive. They're here because in other situations they made sense. There's very little ADHD before there were schools. What we see as pathology when we chain kids to a desk for a whole day might have been seen as an active kid who's getting a lot done out there in the world, and distractibility can be very useful if there are things to be distracted about. You want the person who can spot the tiger when other people are talking around the campfire. So these aren't inherently destructive traits. These are traits that in moderation are enormously useful and adaptive, and they become maladaptive more or less depending on the social context in which people are evaluating them. With adult ADHD, it's too easy to confuse with normality because most adults wish they could concentrate more. Most people wish they could focus on their work better. So that it's very easy for someone who's perfectly normal to think, aha, I'm diseased and I can get a lot better if I get this stimulant pill. It's also, and even more destructively easy, to confuse the symptoms of, quotes, adult ADHD with other psychiatric disorders. So the last thing in the world you want to give a patient with bipolar disorder is a stimulant pill. Not the best treatment for bipolar disorder. But what are the symptoms of bipolar disorder? Very often, presenting symptoms will be distractibility and hyperactivity. If we make ADHD a diagnosis that's easily given to adults, we will attract a whole population of adults who want the free speed, free in the sense of legal speed, not free, but legal. We'll attract a bunch of normals who are hypochondriacal about their ability to focus. And we'll attract a lot of people with other psychiatric diagnoses who will be misdiagnosed as having ADHD and given medicine that will be harmful to them. Now, part of the problem here is epidemiological studies. Are there any epidemiologists in the room? Okay, because I'm going to say nasty things about them. Harvard University is responsible for the two greatest problems in psychiatry. One of them is the publication, the trumpeting, the hyping of ADHD, with one Harvard researcher being sort of the Pied Piper of ADHD hyperdiagnosis, and the other being epidemiological studies that report very high numbers without the necessary caveats. Whenever you see a large N study, a large-scale epidemiological study, it's guaranteed that clinicians were not involved in the evaluations because they're too expensive. So the studies are usually done by telephone, and it'll be a lay interviewer who will just ask the questions. The interviewer doesn't judge clinical significance, and just having symptoms is a fairly meaningless gauge to whether someone has a disorder. Unless there's clinically significant distress or impairment, the diagnosis is not meant to be given. We all have symptoms. That doesn't a disorder make. But epidemiological studies report people who just report symptoms. It really doesn't have the capacity to judge whether these symptoms are severe enough, persistent enough, pervasive enough, and causing enough distress or impairment to be considered a disorder. The study should always report, we found this percentage, but this percentage is only an upper limit. It can't be judged whether this is the actual rate. It should not report that 10% of the population has this or that disorder, but they never report themselves in the cautious way that would be appropriate. So the epidemiological studies always give an exaggeratedly high rate, which researchers love because it makes their disorder more important, and drug companies love because it implies that there's a big under-treatment problem in the population. So the bottom line of this first part of the discussion, the second part we're going to open up for questions and go back and forth, but the bottom line of this early part of our discussion is that we shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater, that there is a population of kids who have an early onset, who have severe symptoms, who are unmistakable. It's not like this is a tough judgment call. They're absolutely unmistakable, who don't respond to normalization, parent training, counseling, who are troubled in every aspect of their life. There isn't like any place where they can be calm and focused. This is pervasively destructive to all aspects of their life, and where a diagnosis of ADHD may be appropriate, and if nothing else works, a treatment for it, medication treatment for it may make sense. But that the diagnosis is now being applied very carelessly after brief evaluations by people who usually aren't that expert in making the diagnosis or are too expert in making the diagnosis, if you get what I mean. So that in the US we have a problem both ways. We have careless diagnosis by pediatricians, primary care doctors, and some child psychiatrists. By the way, 60% of the pills in the United States for ADHD are prescribed by non-psychiatrists. I think it's different here. But a lot of the diagnosis there is being done by people who have very little training, very little time. Often the diagnosis will be made in 10 minutes. Very pressured by salesmen. Sometimes the drug salesmen outnumber the patients in the office. 60% of the medication is being given out carelessly. And you have to worry about the super experts, because some of the super experts have been salesmen for the diagnosis, working hand in glove with the drug companies. And you have to be cautious about the patient organizations, because they get a very big part of their funding from the drug companies. And you have to be cautious about the teachers, because this is a way of quieting down the classroom. So that, and the parents, because it's also makes the kid manageable in the short run. Now, why isn't it so great an idea to give the diagnosis so broadly? First off, it's very easy to give a diagnosis and very difficult to take it away. So you give a diagnosis in a few minutes, and that's there for life. I always believe in underdiagnosing. It's always possible to step up. It's very tough to step down. The diagnosis of kids is very difficult. I think almost always you're seeing the kid on one of the worst days of his life, with everyone upset about the behavior. Very often it's occurring within a crisis situation in the family or the group. And kids are very unstable over time in their symptoms and in the level of severity of their symptoms. So that you can see someone on day one and he looks like he's an absolute disaster, You can see the same kid a month later when there's been quiet, he's grown up a little bit, the family's under less stress, and he'll look completely different. It's wrong to make a diagnosis in anyone, including any adult, based on just one visit, unless you have a very clear-cut history. It's especially wrong to make a diagnosis on kids in first sessions. And we'll do this more maybe after the break. The approach Laura Baxter and I recommend is much more one of step diagnosis. That you wouldn't be making the diagnosis of ADHD on the first visit or the second or the third or the fourth. That you would be doing interventions during those times that would be a lot short of requiring a medication or a medical diagnosis. You would be normalizing, you'd be educating, you'd be counseling, parent training, environmental manipulations, psychotherapy. If all this didn't work and you still had the kid with the very severe symptoms, then you give the diagnosis and then maybe you give the medication. If you follow a stepped approach that provides a kind of obstacle course to prevent careless diagnosis and reckless treatment, then the kids in that 2 or 3% who really need the diagnosis and need the treatment will get it, but you won't have this high rate of mislabeling. So I think we're supposed to take a break now, and what I'd like to do in the second half is not me talk much except in response. So think up questions that you have, and let's try to apply this to the Swedish situation. So it'll be much more interesting. This is a general contextual thing, but how it applies. When you ask questions, make them short so that we get lots of people asking.